A dying millionaire makes a desperate deal with a homeless woman. Marry him for 1 year, and she'll inherit everything. She agrees, expecting luxury. But on their wedding night, he hands her a letter that changes everything. What she discovers will shock you to your core. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our life-changing stories. Trust me, you'll want to stick around until the end of this one. Now, let's begin. I never believed in miracles until I witnessed what happened between Leonard Okafor and a woman named Grace. This is their story, and I promise you, it will change the way you see everything. Leonard Okafor was 52 years old when his world collapsed. He sat in Dr. Morrison's office, his hands trembling as he held the medical report. The words blurred on the page, but their meaning was crystal clear. 6 months. That's all he had left. A rare heart condition that had been silently destroying him for years had finally reached its breaking point. The doctor's voice seemed distant, talking about experimental treatments, clinical trials, and something about insurance requirements that Leonard couldn't quite focus on. You see, Leonard wasn't just any man. He owned half the commercial real estate in the city. His buildings touched the skyline. His name opened doors that others couldn't even find. But money, as he was about to learn, couldn't buy everything. The experimental treatment that could save his life had one bizarre requirement buried in the insurance policy's fine print. He needed to be married. Not just married, but to someone with no complicated family ties, no legal entanglements, someone who wouldn't contest the medical decisions if things went wrong. The irony wasn't lost on Leonard. He'd spent 30 years building an empire, sacrificing relationships, pushing away friends and family. His ex-wife had left him a decade ago, taking their daughter with her. His brother, Philip, hadn't spoken to him in 5 years, after a business deal went sour. He had everything, and he had no one. His lawyer, Mr. Patterson, sat across from him 3 days later, explaining the impossible situation. They needed someone quickly, someone desperate enough to agree without asking too many questions. Someone who had nothing to lose. Leonard stared out his office window at the city below, watching the tiny figures of people going about their lives. And that's when he saw her. Grace Adeyemi had been living on the streets for 3 years. She was 28 years old, though the harsh reality of homelessness had aged her face beyond her years. Every night, she slept in the alley behind Leonard's office building, tucked between cardboard boxes and whatever warmth she could find. She'd lost her parents in a terrible car accident when she was 23. With no other family and mounting debts from the funeral, she'd lost everything. Her apartment, her job, her dignity had all slipped away one piece at a time until she found herself here, invisible to the world that rushed past her every day. But Leonard saw her. On a cold February evening, as snow began to fall, he walked out of his building and stood before her. Grace looked up, expecting him to tell her to move along like everyone else did. Instead, he said something that would change both their lives forever. "I have a proposition for you," Leonard said, his voice steady despite the absurdity of what he was about to offer. "Marry me for 1 year. When the year is over, you'll receive $5 million. No strings attached." Grace stared at him, certain she was hallucinating from hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. The cold had seeped so deep into her bones that she'd stopped shivering. Maybe this was what dying felt like, she thought. Pleasant delusions before the end. But Leonard was real. He explained everything. The diagnosis, the treatment, the insurance requirement, the timeline. He was completely honest about his motives. This wasn't romance. This wasn't charity. This was a business transaction, and he needed her answer quickly. Grace had stopped believing in luck a long time ago, but sitting there in that freezing alley, looking at this stranger offering her a way out, she found herself nodding. What did she have to lose? If this was real, it was salvation. If it was a trick, well, she was already living in hell. The next week moved like a dream. Leonard's people gave Grace new clothes, a temporary apartment, and basic necessities. She signed papers she barely understood, her hand shaking as she wrote her name. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, explained the terms carefully. 1 year of marriage. She would live in Leonard's home, play the role of his wife publicly, but maintain separate spaces privately. When Leonard passed away, or when the year ended, whichever came first, she would inherit $5 million. It seemed too good to be true. The wedding happened at a courthouse on a rainy Tuesday morning. No guests, no celebration, just two strangers making vows that meant everything and nothing at the same time. Grace wore a simple white dress that Leonard's assistant had picked out. Leonard wore an expensive suit that hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight since the diagnosis. Grace noticed how tired his eyes looked, how his hands trembled slightly when he slipped the ring on her finger. That evening, Leonard brought Grace to his mansion for the first time. She'd never seen anything like it. Marble floors stretched endlessly. Crystal chandeliers hung from cathedral ceilings. Paintings that looked like they belonged in museums covered the walls. Grace felt like an imposter, tracking invisible dirt through rooms that cost more than entire neighborhoods. Leonard showed her to a guest room on the second floor. It was bigger than any apartment she'd ever lived in. He was kind but distant, explaining the basic rules of the house. Then, just as he was about to leave, he handed her an envelope. It was sealed with red wax, old-fashioned and formal. "Don't open this until I'm gone," Leonard said quietly. "Promise me." Grace promised, not understanding why, but sensing it was important. She placed the letter in the drawer of her nightstand and tried to sleep in a bed that felt too soft, in a room that felt too big, in a life that felt too impossible to be real. The first weeks were awkward. Leonard spent most of his time in his study or at the hospital for treatments. Grace wandered the mansion like a ghost, afraid to touch anything, afraid to belong anywhere. The staff treated her politely, but distantly. She was neither employer nor employee, neither family nor stranger. She existed in a strange limbo. But slowly, things began to shift. Grace started cooking in the massive kitchen, making simple foods that reminded her of her childhood. Her mother's recipe for rice and stew. Her father's favorite pepper soup. The smells filled the empty mansion with something that felt like home. One evening, Leonard followed the scent downstairs and found Grace at the stove. "That smells like my grandmother's cooking," he said, surprising both of them with the softness in his voice. Grace invited him to sit, and for the first time since their arrangement began, they shared a meal together. Leonard talked about his childhood, growing up poor in a small village before his family moved to the city. How he'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through school. How he'd built his first property from nothing, sleeping in the unfinished building to save money on rent. "I forgot somewhere along the way," Leonard admitted, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "I forgot what I was working for. I forgot who I was." Grace understood. She'd lost herself, too, in a different way. She told him about her parents, about the accident, about the slow descent into homelessness, how people stop seeing you when you have nothing, how you start to stop seeing yourself. Something changed between them after that night. Leonard started teaching Grace about his business. He'd bring files to dinner, explaining deals and investments. He said it was just to pass the time, but Grace suspected he was preparing her for something. She was smarter than she'd given herself credit for. Years of survival on the streets had sharpened her instincts, taught her to read people, to see beneath surfaces. Grace helped Leonard in return, though neither of them spoke about it directly. She made sure he took his medications on time. She accompanied him to treatments, holding his hand when the pain got bad. She reminded him to eat, to rest, to take walks in the garden even when he didn't want to move. His health, mysteriously, began to improve slightly. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. 4 months into their arrangement, Philip showed up. Leonard's younger brother arrived unannounced, bursting through the front door with lawyers and demands. He was furious about the marriage, about Grace, about being cut out of Leonard's will. He accused Grace of being a con artist, of manipulating a sick man. He threatened to take everything to court. Grace expected Leonard to wilt under his brother's anger. Instead, she watched something fierce awaken in him. Leonard stood between Philip and Grace, his voice steel. "She's shown me more humanity in 4 months than you've shown me in 50 years, Leonard said. "Get out of my house." Philip left, but his threats hung in the air like poison. He would be back with lawyers, with allegations, with everything he could use to destroy the marriage and claim Leonard's estate for himself. That night, Leonard's condition took a turn for the worse. Grace found him collapsed in his study, barely breathing. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and fear. Grace sat in the waiting room for 14 hours while doctors worked to stabilize him. She didn't leave. She didn't eat. She just prayed. Something she hadn't done since losing her parents. When they finally let her see him, Leonard looked so small in the hospital bed. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that beeped and hummed. He opened his eyes when she took his hand. "The letter," he whispered. "If I don't make it through this, open the letter." "You're going to make it through this," Grace said fiercely, surprised by the intensity of her own emotion. When had this stopped being an arrangement? When had Leonard become more than just a meal ticket to a better life? The doctors recommended emergency surgery. It was risky, experimental, with only a 10% chance of success. Leonard refused at first. He was tired, ready to accept his fate. But Grace wouldn't let him give up. "You don't get to quit," she told him, tears streaming down her face. "Not after you saved my life. Not after you showed me I was still worth saving. You fight, Leonard. You fight because I need you to." Something in her words reached him. Leonard agreed to the surgery. As they wheeled him away, he squeezed Grace's hand one last time. Philip appeared in the hallway with his lawyers, trying to block the surgery, trying to take control as next of kin. Grace stood her ground, showing them the marriage certificate, the medical proxy Leonard had signed. She was his wife, and she would make the decisions. The surgery took 12 hours. Grace paced the waiting room, watching the sun set and rise again through the windows. Philip sat in the corner, glaring at her, waiting for Leonard to die so he could contest everything. Grace didn't care. All she cared about was the man fighting for his life behind those operating room doors. When the surgeon finally emerged, exhausted but smiling, Grace's legs nearly gave out. Leonard had survived. Against all odds, his heart was beating strong. It was unprecedented, the doctor said. A miracle. Leonard's recovery took 3 months. Grace never left his side. She read to him, talked to him, helped him through physical therapy. As he grew stronger, their conversations grew deeper. They laughed together. They cried together. They became something neither of them had planned for. They became friends. maybe more than friends. One evening, as Leonard sat in a wheelchair in the hospital garden, he asked Grace to open the letter. Not because he was dying, but because he wanted her to know the truth while he could explain it. Grace's hands shook as she broke the seal she'd preserved for so long. Inside were several documents, instructions for managing Leonard's business empire, details about investments and properties, but also something else, evidence of Philip's embezzlement, documents proving he'd been stealing from the company for years, and a letter, written in Leonard's own hand, explaining everything. Leonard had known Philip would try to take everything. He'd needed someone pure-hearted, someone who hadn't been corrupted by wealth, to protect his legacy. He'd chosen Grace not just because she was desperate, but because in watching her survive with dignity on those streets, he'd seen something rare: integrity, strength, goodness. But the letter revealed something more. Leonard had been training Grace all along, teaching her about business not to pass time, but to prepare her to take over. He wanted his wealth to help people, to create opportunities for those society had forgotten, like Grace had been forgotten. He'd seen in her the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but for everything he'd built. "I picked you because you needed saving," Leonard admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But you ended up saving me instead. You gave me a reason to fight. You reminded me what it means to be human." Grace looked at this man who had been a stranger 8 months ago. This man who had offered her a business deal and given her a life. This man who had been dying and chosen to live because she asked him to. "The year is almost up," Leonard said quietly. "Our contract ends in 6 weeks. You'll get your $5 million. You can walk away, start fresh, live whatever life you want. Or—" he paused, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. "Or," Grace prompted, "or you can stay. Not because of money or contracts or obligations, but because somewhere between that alley and this moment, I fell in love with you. And I think, maybe, you might feel something for me, too." Grace had spent 3 years on the streets. She'd learned to survive without hope, without trust, without believing in happy endings. But Leonard had taught her something more valuable than survival. He taught her to live again, to believe again, to love again. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the contract they'd signed a year ago. She'd been carrying it with her for months, she realized. She held it up, and then slowly, deliberately, she tore it in half. "I threw away my copy months ago," Grace said, smiling through tears. "I didn't need it anymore." 1 year after that cold February night in the alley, Leonard and Grace stood in the same courthouse where they'd first married. But this time, there were guests. The staff from the mansion who had watched them fall in love. Mr. Patterson, who had orchestrated their first arrangement and was now crying openly. Even some of the people Grace had known from the streets cleaned up and invited to witness something beautiful. They exchanged new vows, not the hollow words of a business transaction, but promises built on truth and tested by fire. Leonard was stronger now, healthy, given a second chance at life. Grace was transformed, not by wealth, but by love, by purpose, by knowing she mattered. Philip was in prison, finally facing consequences for his crimes. Leonard's company had been restructured into a charitable foundation, with Grace as its director. They'd already helped 200 homeless people find housing and jobs. They'd funded 3 medical clinics in underserved neighborhoods. They were using Leonard's fortune exactly as he'd dreamed, helping people whose society had forgotten. As they walked out of the courthouse as husband and wife, for real this time, Grace thought about that night in the alley, about how close she'd come to giving up, about how one moment, one decision, one person can change everything. Leonard had offered her $5 million to pretend to be his wife. Instead, he'd given her something worth infinitely more. He'd given her herself back, and she'd given him a reason to live. That's the thing about miracles. They don't always look like what we expect. Sometimes they look like a desperate millionaire and a homeless woman making an impossible deal. Sometimes they look like two broken people finding wholeness in each other. Sometimes they look like love growing in the last place anyone would think to look for it. Leonard and Grace's story isn't just about a business deal that became real. It's about two people who were dying in different ways, who saved each other by choosing to see the humanity they'd both lost sight of. It's about second chances and the transformative power of genuine connection. Grace never forgot where she came from. Every week, she walks through the alleys behind Leonard's buildings, talking to the people living there, offering help, offering hope. And every time, she remembers the man who stopped and saw her when everyone else looked away. And Leonard never forgot what Grace taught him, that wealth without humanity is just numbers on a page, that success without connection is just an empty mansion, that being alive and having a life are two very different things. They saved each other. That's what miracles really are. Two broken pieces that somehow fit together to make something whole. This incredible story reminds us that sometimes the people we least expect can change our lives forever. Leonard found life in Grace, and Grace found purpose in Leonard. If this story touched your heart, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment telling us what you would have done in Grace's situation. Subscribe for more amazing real-life stories that prove miracles still happen. Until next time, remember, kindness is never wasted, and sometimes the best investments we make are in each other.